I always thought that moving to a remote place would be the perfect solution to start a new life, far from the chaos of the city. When I saw the ad for a small cabin in Elkhaven Valley, surrounded by mountains and forests, I felt it was exactly what I needed. My name is Daniel, and at that moment everything seemed promising. The journey there was long, passing through narrow roads and wooden bridges worn by time. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked like it came straight out of a dream. Isolated, rustic, but cozy. The only neighbors were the trees stretching in all directions. The first few days were peaceful. I spent the mornings exploring the forest and the nights reading by the light of a lantern. But soon I began to notice something strange, the sounds. It was as if the forest came alive at night. Branches creaked, light footsteps echoed on the ground, and whispered voices resonated in the distance. I convinced myself it was just solitude playing tricks on my mind. But one night I heard something different. It wasn't just the sounds of animals. It was heavy footsteps, followed by guttural breathing so close that I shivered. I grabbed a flashlight and, with my heart racing, went to the window. There was nothing there, just the endless darkness of the forest. On the third day, I decided to explore the forest more deeply. I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing unusual there, that it was all just my imagination. During the walk, I noticed something peculiar. The trees were marked with strange symbols, like runes, carved precisely into their trunks. In the center of a clearing, I came across a circle of stones, arranged in a way that seemed intentional, almost ritualistic. Bones were scattered around, too large to be from common animals. A metallic smell permeated the air, and I felt a nausea that forced me to step back. That night, the sounds returned, but this time they were more intense. It seemed like something, or someone, was circling the cabin. I locked the doors and windows, but the noise didn't stop. Suddenly I heard a sharp scream coming from the forest, something that wasn't human or animal. The next morning I decided I needed answers. I took my car and drove to the nearest town, almost an hour away. When I mentioned Elkhaven Valley to the gas station attendant, he looked visibly uncomfortable. "You shouldn't be there," he said, avoiding eye contact. When I asked why, he hesitated before adding, "Strange things happen in that place. People disappear, animals too. Some say the valley is cursed." On the way back, I saw a man standing by the side of the road. He was barefoot, wearing tattered clothes, with sunken, lifeless eyes. When I stopped to ask if he needed help, he simply looked at me and said, "They'll come at night. Don't trust what your eyes see." At dusk, I started to feel like I was being watched. The forest seemed darker, the shadows denser. Then I heard a distinct sound, claws scraping against the cabin's wood. I grabbed a kitchen knife and prepared to face whatever it was. When I looked out the window, I saw a tall, slender creature with disproportionate limbs and glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight. Its skin was pale and stretched over prominent bones. It saw me. I don't know how, but I knew it did. We stared at each other for seconds that felt like an eternity before it disappeared into the darkness with unnatural speed. I decided I needed to know more. The next day, I returned to the clearing with the stones. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a pattern on the ground, a sort of map or guide that seemed to lead to another place in the forest. I followed the trail and found a cave hidden among the rocks. Inside, there were paintings on the walls, depicting human figures surrounded by creatures similar to what I'd seen. The paintings told a story, a village that worshipped the creatures in exchange for protection, but eventually rebelled. The creatures destroyed them. That night, everything changed. The creatures returned, but they weren't alone. I could hear their movements around the cabin, the sound of branches breaking and stones being thrown against the windows. I tried to stay calm, but the terror was paralyzing. The lantern's light flickered, casting shadows that seemed to come alive. I smelled rot, like decaying flesh, and soon realized there was no escape. At the last moment, I remembered the paintings in the cave and what seemed to be a solution, a specific symbol drawn on the ground. Using salt, I recreated the pattern in the center of the room. The creatures entered but stopped before crossing the symbol. Their eyes glowed with hatred, but they couldn't reach me. I stayed there until dawn, when they finally disappeared into the forest. I left Elkhaven Valley that very morning. I never went back, but to this day, on quiet nights, I still hear the whispers and feel that they haven't forgotten me. My name is Matthew, and when I decided to move to Ravendale, a quiet village surrounded by dense forests, I expected nothing but peace and inspiration. It was a town where time seemed to stand still, with its cobblestone streets and centuries-old houses. For a writer like me, it was paradise, or so it seemed. My new home was an old structure with large windows and a basement that creaked under the weight of its years. The villagers were friendly at first, but there was something in their eyes that unsettled me, as if they were hiding a secret. One specific phrase stuck with me: never go out at night without a lantern, and if you hear footsteps, don't look back. I ignored the warning. At first I attributed their words to local superstitions. After all, every small town has its peculiarities. Little did I know that these peculiarities would mark the beginning of my nightmare. My first night was restless. The silence was oppressive, interrupted only by the wind whistling around the house. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a strange sound outside. It was as if something was scraping against the walls, a low but unsettling noise. I got up, opened the window and looked into the yard. The moonlight illuminated the garden, and for a moment I swore I saw a tall, thin silhouette among the trees. I rubbed my eyes, but there was nothing there. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. However, the feeling of being watched lingered. I closed the curtains, locked the doors, and went back to bed, but sleep did not come easily. The next day, I went to the town's only bakery to buy fresh bread. There, I met Margaret, an elderly woman who seemed to be the matriarch of the village. We talked about trivial things until, hesitantly, I mentioned what I'd seen the previous night. Her face changed instantly, becoming serious. "You saw something, didn't you? Something in the shadows." Before I could respond, she continued, "Whatever you saw, it's not your imagination. It's here, it's always been here." I tried to ask more questions, but Margaret refused to say anything else besides a warning: don't go into the woods alone, especially at night. That night, while I was writing in the living room, I heard the sound again. Scraping, scratching, as if something was trying to get in. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the window. This time, I saw it clearly. A tall, thin figure with pale skin and eyes that glowed faintly red stood in the middle of the yard. My heart raced. I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. By the time I managed to move, the figure had already vanished. I locked every window and refused to turn off the lights for the rest of the night. The fear consumed me, but I still tried to rationalize what I had seen. The next day, I went to the local library in search of answers. The historical records were vague, but they mentioned frequent disappearances in the region over the decades. The stories always involved people walking alone at night or living on the village's outskirts, like me. I spoke to a man named Thomas, who seemed to know more than the others. He told me about the Predator, a legend that claimed an ancient creature lived in the shadows of the forest, feeding on unwary travelers. "It's not a legend," he said with a somber look. "We've seen it. We've felt it." I left the library with a knot in my stomach, feeling that something was very wrong, but I didn't know what to do. That night, the terror reached its peak. I was in bed when I heard footsteps in the hallway. It was impossible. I was alone in the house. I got up carefully, grabbing the flashlight by the bed. The footsteps continued, louder, closer. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. But then I heard a sound coming from the basement, a deep, labored breathing. Logic told me to run, but something drew me to those stairs. When I descended, the flashlight briefly illuminated a crouched figure in the corner, with eyes glowing like embers. I ran, but the creature followed. Its footsteps were quick, growing closer and closer. I fled the house and ran toward the village, screaming for help. But the streets were deserted and the house lights were off. When I finally reached the town square, Margaret was waiting for me. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried a deep sadness. "You saw it, didn't you? Now it will never leave you." She explained that Ravendale was cursed, and the Predator was an ancient force, something that couldn't be destroyed, only avoided. "That's why we keep our lights on and never go out at night. But you attracted it, and now it has chosen you. I wanted to run, but I knew there was no escape. That night, I stayed locked in Margaret's house, listening to the Predator's footsteps outside, waiting for me. Since then, I live with the constant feeling of being watched, hunted. I left Ravendale, but it follows me, because once you cross paths with the Predator, it never lets you go." My name is Eric, and 3 months ago I moved to Ravenhill, an isolated town nestled in the heart of the mountains. I've always been drawn to remote places. The idea of peace and tranquility seemed perfect for my work as an illustrator. The town was small, with old houses and streets that were almost always deserted, except on weekends when the locals gathered in the central square. The house I rented was on the edge of the forest, far from the town centre. It was charming, though it needed some repairs. On my first night, a deep howl echoed through the woods. It was long and piercing, unlike anything I had ever heard before. I convinced myself it must have been a wolf. After all, we were surrounded by dense forests. However, the townsfolk seemed tenser than usual when I mentioned the sound. "Stay inside at night," said the owner of the local convenience store, "and if you hear something, don't open the door." She said it so seriously that I felt a chill run down my spine. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to explore the surroundings. I brought my camera and a notebook, hoping to capture something that could inspire my drawings. The forest was quiet, but there was an undeniable feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake. About an hour later, I stumbled upon deep marks in the ground, as if something heavy had dragged its claws through the earth. Nearby trees were also scratched, and the air carried a metallic scent, almost like blood. I returned home with a sense of unease I couldn't explain. That night, the howls started again, but this time they sounded closer, as if the creature was circling my house. The following day, I went to the local mechanic to pick up my car. There I met Henry, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a weary look. He seemed friendly until I mentioned the sounds in the forest. His face instantly hardened. "You shouldn't have moved into that house," he said. "No one in Ravenhill lives near the forest for a reason." When I pressed him for details, he just shook his head. "They come with the full moon, it's not safe." It sounded absurd, but the conviction in his voice unsettled me. Before I could ask more, Henry turned away and silently resumed his work. That night, the full moon lit up the sky like a spotlight. I tried to distract myself with work, but the howls started early, followed by sounds that resembled scratching on wood. I approached the window with a flashlight in hand and saw something that made my heart stop. At the edge of the forest, there was a massive figure crouching, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. Its body was covered in dark fur, and its muscles were grotesquely large. When the creature raised its head and sniffed the air, I shut the curtains and hid in my room. The creature lingered outside for hours, prowling around the house until silence finally returned. The next day, I sought out Eleanor, the town's librarian. She seemed to be the only person willing to listen without dismissing me as crazy. After some time, she sighed and pulled an old book from a dusty shelf. The book was a collection of local accounts, mentioning attacks by beasts that occurred in regular cycles, always under the full moon. The victims were mutilated in ways that defied explanation. Eleanor looked at me seriously. "You saw it, didn't you? The werewolf?" My mouth went dry. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fit together. The following night, I couldn't sleep. I grabbed an old gun I found in the basement and waited, knowing the creature would likely return. When the howls began, I felt fear heavier than ever before. The creature appeared again, but this time it wasn't just prowling. It attacked the door with brutal force, nearly breaking it down. I ran to the basement, trying to shield myself. When the creature finally broke in, I heard its heavy footsteps above me. Then it stopped. A tense silence followed before a loud, piercing scream echoed through the night. I crept upstairs slowly and found the creature collapsed, wounded but still alive. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt a strange, almost human connection. Eleanor and Henry arrived shortly after, carrying improvised tools. They seemed to know exactly what to do, as if they'd dealt with this before. The creature tried to resist, but they subdued it and finally ended its suffering. That was when Eleanor explained the truth. The werewolf was a Ravenhill resident, cursed decades ago by something no one could remember. The curse passed down in cycles, from generation to generation, and the town had learned to live with it. I left Ravenhill the next morning, but the trauma of that experience still haunts me. Even now, far from the mountains, I sometimes hear howls at night, and I can't help but wonder, did the curse stay behind?